All day long I'd been dying for a beer. I'd got this new contract working on a site down by Heathrow Airport, which was paying good money, but meant getting up at 5 in the morning and driving more than 100 miles. We finished quite early, and I'd normally be home by 6, but the days were still pretty exhausting. After a long, hard day, the only way I can unwind is to go down the pub for a few pints. Most of the time that was okay, but every now and then Sandra would kick up a fuss and have a go at me for not spending enough time with her and the kids. When that happened, I'd stay in for a couple of nights and make sure I got in the way. Then she'd be practically begging me to go down the pub, just so she could have some peace and quiet. I've been a good boy for the past 2 nights, even helping out with housework and stuff like that. And now, I was going to get my reward. I was going to go down my local, have a couple of games of pool and get completely and utterly plastered. At around 2 PM, just as I was finishing up for the day, Mick called my mobile and asked me to meet him at Mark's Tate as soon as possible. It was a place we've met a few times before because it's roughly halfway between our 2 houses, but it meant a detour on the way home and therefore a delay in getting the beers in. Mick didn't say why he wanted to meet, so I assumed it was something to do with drugs. Either another run he wanted me to go on or some new stock he wanted me to sell. I was really tempted to say I couldn't make it, but I didn't want to let him down. I'd been doing a lot of work on his house during the evening and at weekends, and I didn't want to risk losing the extra income. At first I said I'd meet him at 4 PM, but then I changed it to 5 PM, because that way I knew I'd have time for a couple of quick beers on the way. At that exact time, in a quiet corner of the TGI Fridays at the Lakeside Shopping Centre in Thurrock, Tate, Tucker and Rolfe were deep in discussion. The initial plan could not have been more straightforward. They had agreed with Steele that they would be hiding in some bushes when the plane landed, leap out, fire a few shots into the air to scare the pilot, and then take away the 30 kilos of pure, unadulterated Charlie. To make it look good and ensure that no one suspected it was an inside job, they'd have to threaten Steele as well, maybe even tie him up for a while, but it would all be play acting. The firm would leave with all the drugs and meet up with Steele a couple of days later to divide it all up. But now the plan had changed. As far as Tate was concerned, he explained to the others, Mickey Steele was guilty of having tried to rip the firm off with the dodgy cannabis. Okay, so he had eventually paid the money back, but he had still caused them a huge amount of grief. And now, it was payback time. Rather than handing over 10 kilos of pure cocaine, they would give Steele just 3 kilos of the good stuff, mixed with a load of impurities such as caffeine or chalk dust to make it up to the full weight. That would leave the firm with 27 kilos of premium quality Bolivian marching powder between them. Tate had already discussed the price with a certain John McCarthy, a man well used to dealing in large amounts of the white stuff, and the quote that came back was one of those magical numbers that whether you're a pop star, a merchant banker, or just a gangster, announces to the world that you have most definitely arrived. McCarthy was going to pay the firm a cool £1 million. Steele had apparently already been paid his fee for flying the plane, and the drugs were packed up and standing by to be collected in Holland. The only delay to the deal was the snow on the ground, which Steele explained made landing in such a small space too hazardous, even for a pilot as skilled as he was. But the firm regarded the money as good as theirs. To celebrate, they had booked a table for that same evening at the Global Net Cafe in Romford, where along with their girlfriends they would toast their soon-to-be stinking rich status. Donna Jaggers was also just finishing work for the day when Craig Rolfe called her. It was around 3 PM, and I was just getting ready to leave work when he phoned. He said that Mickey the pilot had been in touch earlier in the day and wanted to meet Tucker and Tate that evening to show them where he was going to land the plane. Craig was really excited that the deal was getting so imminent. He wanted me to wear something new at the mill that evening, so he said he'd take me to the Lakeside Shopping Centre, go off to see the airstrip and then come back and pick me up. I met him at home an hour or so later, and he told me for the first time about the change in the plans and how they were going to rip Mickey off. As Craig explained what was going on, I was getting more and more worried, and I told him that I didn't want him to have any part in it. He told me that they were only going to look at a field, that Mickey didn't know he was going to be driving, and that he wasn't nearly as heavily involved in what was going on as the other two were. But mostly, he told me about the money. He said that for once, he would have enough money to enable us to go ahead with whatever plans we wanted. We'd be able to live anywhere and do nothing all day. Visit anywhere in the world. It would be the life we always dreamed of. I realised there was no way I was going to be able to talk him out of it, even though I didn't want him to go through with it. It was obvious he was just in too deep. As Rolfe dropped her off at the shopping centre, Jaggers tried one last time to talk him out of going to the rendezvous, but his mind was made up. He said to me, if I don't go, then Tony can turn around later when the drugs come in and say I didn't have anything to do with the arrangements, so my cut will be smaller. I don't want that to happen. I've got to do my bit. I've got to play my part. And then he left. As he approached the outskirts of Mark's Tate, Darren Nichols was beginning to realise that stopping off for a beer on the way had been a terrible mistake. Darren Nichols states, "He had really given me a taste for it, but I hadn't had anywhere near enough. I'd only teased my taste buds. As I parked up, I started hoping that whatever it was that Mick wanted, it wouldn't take too long so I could get home and get on with some serious drinking. After a few minutes, I saw a familiar red Hilux pull up and went over and got in the passenger side. Mick started telling me that he and Pat had finally sorted their differences out and that he was planning to meet him that evening. Apparently a plane with a mother load of cocaine was going to be landing in some field and they were going to meet it for some kind of deal. Sounds good, I said. So what do you want me to do? Mick explained that my role was to drive Jack to the meeting place and then pick the two of them up afterwards. I want Pat to think that I'm meeting him on my own, he told me. Now this is the point in the story where people start saying to me, didn't you think it was all a bit odd? Weren't there alarm bells ringing in your head? The answer I'm afraid to say is no. As far as I was concerned, there was some kind of deal going on between Pat and Mick. I knew by then Pat was a bit of a loose cannon, especially after the pizza incident, and was not adverse to ripping people off, even his friends. Now it was unlikely he'd try anything with Mick, but if it was me, I would have played it the same way. Rather than going down to the meet with all the money, I'd have someone else holding it nearby to make sure it wasn't a trap. It was exactly the same deal that I'd pulled when I was trying to sell that counterfeit money at the hotel. It was standard underworld practice. I didn't see anything wrong with it at all. As Mick and I were talking, Jack pulled up behind in his tatty old B-Reg VW Passat that I'd actually sold to Mick a couple of weeks earlier. Jack came up to say a quick hello, and then we set off towards the Halfway House pub, me and Mick in the Hilux and Jack following behind. On the way, Mick explained that when we got a bit nearer, we would pull over so I could get in the Passat with Jack. Mick didn't want us to be seen, otherwise Tate would realise he had company. Once I was in the other car, Jack would tell me exactly what to do. Just before we got to the pub, we stopped in the entrance to the country park, and Mick told me to get into the Passat with Jack, who turned the car round and then produced a set of false number plates with double-sided sticky tape on them. He tried to stick them over the existing plates, but it was too damp and wet, so he eventually gave up. I got into the driver's seat, and he told me to head to the Halfway House and wait close to the exit of the car park. From where we were, we had a clear view of the car park entrance and could see all the cars coming in. We could also see Mick's Hilux parked on the other side of the pub, but no sign of Mick. "What are we waiting for?" I asked Jack. There was no reply. It was pretty cold, so I kept the engine running to stop the windows steaming up and to stop us freezing. But I knew a much better way of staying warm. "Hey," I said, "while we're waiting, let's go in the pub and have a couple of beers." Jack slowly turned his head and looked at me. "No," he said firmly. I suppose I wasn't all that surprised. Jack wasn't just teetotal, he was some kind of freak. All he ever drank was water and orange juice. He didn't touch anything fizzy and wouldn't go near tea or coffee. His only vice was chocolate. He ate Galaxy bars like they were going out of fashion. All of a sudden, Jack said, "Right, off we go." As I pulled away, I looked over towards the car park entrance and saw a dark blue Range Rover coming in. I couldn't see who was inside, but I assumed it was Pat's car. We set off down the A130, and Jack said he was going to show me where to drop him off and pick him up, and that I was to leave him there and come back when he rang me as soon as they had completed the deal. I drove over the Rettendon Turnpike, still on the A130 towards Chelmsford. I went up the hill through Rettendon village and was bombing down the other side when Jack told me to slow down, as we would soon be doing a right turn. He pointed out this tiny little lane up ahead and told me to turn into it and turn the car round immediately. I watched as Jack got out of the car and took some stuff off the back seat. He took a coat, a prison donkey jacket with the plastic bit on the back cut off, and a big canvas sausage bag. As Jack was walking away, I asked him if I had time for a quick beer while he was gone. "What are you, some kind of alcoholic? We won't be long, just wait, and when you come back, turn around straight away so we can head off." Then he vanished in the darkness, and I drove off. Sitting alone at home, Sarah Saunders was starting to feel a little sorry for herself. Earlier that day, she had phoned Pat Tate, hoping to have a civilised discussion about how much maintenance he planned to pay her. She might just as well have hoped for world peace. Tate had been almost impossible to talk to. He was in a really scary, excited, hyped up state, and had obviously been taking drugs. There was no point in trying to reason with him like that. It had ended up in a furious row and he had slammed down the phone. But despite everything that had happened, Saunders still cared for Tate deeply, and was anxious that their son would have a proper relationship with his father. She glanced at the watch. It had been more than 5 hours since they had last spoken. With any luck, he might have calmed down. She took a deep breath and reached for the phone. It may have been close to freezing outside, but the atmosphere inside the Range Rover was warm and jolly. Tate, Tucker and Rolfe were preoccupied with the vast amount of money they were soon to be collecting and the pre-celebration meal they had planned for later that evening. They were firing questions at Steele, who was sitting in the back beside Tate, asking exactly when he'd be leaving for Holland and when he'd be landing. In between giving directions to Craig Rolfe, Steele reassured the gang that they were at most a couple of days away from their nice little earner. Just as the Range Rover turned into Workhouse Lane, Tate's mobile came to life. Hello? Oh, hello, darling. Really? Oh, you sweetheart. Look, maybe I can come by tomorrow. Listen, I can't talk now with some people, alright? We'll talk later, okay? Miss you too. Bye. Steele bit his lip as he tried to stop his anger mounting. Up until that point, everything that Sarah Saunders had told him indicated that she and Tate could hardly stand each other. Yet here they were having this loving, caring conversation. But Steele didn't have time to dwell on it for long. A split second later, the Range Rover reached the bottom of the lane. There's a gate down here, said Rolfe. What do you want to do? Steele had to think quickly. When he and Jack had checked the lane out before, the gate had been open. Had Jack shut it for some reason? Perhaps there were some other people in the field. Perhaps Jack wasn't there at all. The only thing to do was to play it by ear. I'll get it, he said. You lot stay in the warm. Craig Rolfe was the first to die. As soon as the rear passenger door had opened and Steele was clear, Jack Wholmes had leaned in with a pump action. He pressed the barrel against the back of the driver's headrest and pulled the trigger. The pellets ripped through the fabric and straight through Rolfe's skull, leaving a gaping hole right between his eyes. Both his hands were still on the steering wheel. His foot was on the brake. He looked like he had just pulled up at a set of traffic lights. Tony Tucker was next. With the blast ringing in his ears from just a split second before, he had no time to react. Wholmes moved the gun and shot him in the back of the head. He died with his legs crossed and his mobile phone sitting in his lap. Tate, sitting in the back seat, was the only one who would have known he was about to die. By the time Wholmes trained the gun on him, less than 2 seconds after firing the first shot, Tate was wailing and pushing himself into the corner of the car, making a futile escape. Wholmes paused for a second, as Tate began begging for his life, wailing and whining. This time, Steele fired first, both barrels ripping through Tate's belly. Wait! Stop! What are you doing? No! Tate's voice was getting higher and higher as his pleas got more desperate. Then Steele appeared beside Wholmes holding a gun, and Tate knew it was all over. He raised his hands to protect himself with such ferocity that his knuckles smashed through the rear window and he screamed for his life. At that same instant, one shot tore off the left side of his face, while another split open his chest, ripping his liver apart. There was no doubt that the three were dead, but this was more than just an execution. Wholmes pumped his shotgun and opened the front door of the car. He put the barrel up against what was left of Tucker's head and fired again. The pressure inside Tucker's skull was more than it could bear. His head literally exploded as the bones broke through the skin. Then Wholmes went round to Rolfe and did the same. This time the shots were fired from such close range that they singed the fur collar on his anorak and pushed his jawbone across to where his ear would normally be. In the meantime, Steele was getting excited and reached out to Wholmes. "Give me more cartridges! Give me more cartridges!" He loaded and fired again, only to have his gun fall apart. Both men burst out laughing, and Steele scrambled around on the floor in the pitch black, looking for his barrel. Darren Nichols had driven down the road past several tempting pubs and parked on the side of the road to wait for Jack to call him. I checked my phone and saw I wasn't picking up much of a signal, so I decided to move. I ended up driving back past the lane and then took the first turning on the left. I went down a little way and turned around, so I ended up parked on a bit of a hill. I looked at the phone again to check the signal, and at that very moment it started ringing. It was Jack. "Come and get us," he said. "That was quick," I replied. But the line had already gone dead. He'd hung up. I retraced my steps, pulled into the lane and immediately turned the car around. Almost straight away, Jack was at the back door of the car and got in, sitting down in the darkness. "Where's Mick?" I asked. He won't be long. He's just dropped something. Doesn't want to leave it there," said Jack. And then he made this really weird sound, a bit like a series of quiet little snorts. I could just about make out his silhouette in the rear-view mirror, and then his big shoulders were bobbing up and down. It took me a while to work out what was going on. Jack was giggling. I was still looking at Jack in the rear-view mirror when Mick appeared and opened the front passenger door. As soon as he did, the interior light came on, and that's when I saw Jack's hands. He was wearing surgical gloves, and they'd been splashed with streaks of blood, and on the back of one of them was a lump of greyish slime surrounded by lumps of hair and skin and more blood. "Turn that fucking light out!" screamed Mick. I didn't think, I just went into autopilot, started scrambling about on the roof of the car trying to find the light switch, but as Mick sat down and shut the door, the light went off anyway. And suddenly, it was pitch black again. But I could still see Jack's hands, and I could still see the blood and bits of brain. I felt like someone had sucked all the air out of me because I wanted to speak. I desperately wanted to say something, but no matter how I tried, I just couldn't get any words out. Mick told me to get going, and though my mind was elsewhere, my body somehow obeyed, putting the car into gear and moving off towards the main road. From then, everything happened in slow motion. I saw the headlights, heard the screech of tyres, and braced myself for impact. But it never came. Mick had grabbed the steering wheel at the last moment and wrenched it to one side, avoiding a crash by just a few inches. The other driver flashed his lights and swore at me out of his half-open window. I just pulled out onto the main road without looking. But I honestly didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just sat there like a zombie. "For fuck's sake, Darren, drive carefully," said Mick. "What are you trying to do, kill us all?" Jack, sitting behind me, thumped the back of my seat with his fist. "Arsehole," he growled. I was still in shock, but I felt myself slowly coming back down to earth. I mumbled a half-hearted apology and carried on driving back towards the Rettendon turnpike. All at once, I felt like I was going to be sick, that I had a splitting headache, that I was freezing cold and boiling hot. My mind was racing, but it kept coming back to the fact I'd only been away for a couple of minutes. Surely they didn't have time to do anything. I desperately wanted to know what exactly happened back there, but at the same time I didn't want to know anything about it. I just couldn't take it in. I wanted to pretend that I hadn't seen or heard anything, but that wasn't going to happen. Mick turned to Jack and broke the silence. "Those cunts won't be threatening us again," he said. "Too right," came the reply. I was just trying to concentrate on the road when a glint of metal caught my eye. I chanced a sideways glance and saw that Mick was passing Jack the barrels of a sawn-off shotgun, followed by the stock and the trigger mechanism. And then it got worse. Jack moved forward so he was sitting with his head between the two front seats, just the way that naughty kids do when they're little. And he and Mick started going over all the details of what they'd done. "I'll tell you, Darren, it was well funny," he said with a grin. "Because Mick shot one of them and his fucking gun fell apart, bits all over the place. That's what he was looking for, the thing he dropped. I couldn't believe it. There we were trying to do a job and he spends half the time on the floor trying to find the barrel." By now, Mick was smiling too. "Did you shoot the back window by mistake?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "Nah, I think Pat must have done it with his hand. I never miss. Not from that distance anyway." Then Jack turned to me. "You should have seen him, Darren. It was pathetic. Hard man." Squealing like a baby he was. I had absolutely no idea what to say or what to do. How do you respond to something like that? I felt as if I was no longer in the car, just a spectator looking on and listening in. All I could think was, what am I doing here? What's going to happen now? Mick spoke again. "You'll never believe it, Jack. That soppy cow Sarah, she only phoned Pat's mobile just as we were going down the lane. All that talk about how she hates him and wants him out of her life, and how pleased she'd be if something bad happened to him. And there they were having this lovey-dovey chat. Made me want to throw up. Well, actually, I was shitting myself. I was just waiting for him to say, 'Oh yeah, I'm here with Mick and some of the lads.' And that would have been it, wouldn't it? We'd have had to call the whole bloody thing off. But he never did, thank God. I bet she'd kick herself if she knew how close she had come to saving him." Jack grunted in agreement, and Mick continued. "Oh, mind you, I don't know how'd have stopped you. When we got down the bottom of that lane and the gate was locked, I didn't have a clue where you were until you handed me the gun and started shooting. I thought we'd blown it." I heard myself speak, my voice soft and low. "I hope I never upset the two of you." For some reason, Mick and Jack thought this was hilarious. The two of them fell about, absolutely pissing themselves. "Nah," chuckled Mick, wiping away tears of laughter. "You're not like them. It wouldn't happen to you." Although I knew the roads reasonably well, the state I was in meant that Mick and Jack had to give me instructions for every turn like I was some kind of learner driver. Left at the swimming pool, left at the set of traffic lights, down the bottom, second on the right into the car park of the Hungry Horse pub. I spotted Mick's Toyota Hilux parked up in the corner and pulled the Passat alongside. It was only when I tried to stand up that I realised how much I was shaking. Jack and Mick jumped out and started changing their clothes. They were still really animated and talking quickly, but I was no longer listening to what they were saying. It was then that I noticed for the first time that they were wearing identical outfits, dark green boiler suits, Wellington boots and surgical rubber gloves, all of which were stuffed into a couple of bin liners and placed in the back of the truck. And as I stood watching them, I tried to throw up, but nothing came out. Jack took the Passat and drove off, while Mick got into the Hilux and waved me into the passenger seat. Then we set off for Mark's Tate where my own car was waiting. As soon as Jack had gone, Mick's mood changed. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He was obviously going over the evening's events in his mind. Then after a few minutes of silence, he suddenly said, "Jack's a cold-hearted bastard." "What do you mean?" I asked. Well, the second I got out the Range Rover, he leaned in with a pump action and shot the three of them. Boom, 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 just like that, like it was nothing to worry about. He was just so detached, so emotionless. He was like he was serving up chips or something. I mean, he could have been doing anything. But we had to do it together, you see. That way one of us could never give evidence against the other. We'd both be equally guilty. That was the deal. I said nothing. All day long I'd been dying for a beer, but now all I could think about was drinking half a bottle of whiskey to blot everything out. I suggested we both go for a drink, or three. At first Mick agreed, but by the time we got back to Mark's, Tate had changed his mind and said it would be best if we went straight home. I knew my wife and kids were expecting me, but I just couldn't face them. I pulled out my mobile and phoned my mate Rick, told him I'd had a really shitty day and asked him to meet me down the pub. He stayed for a couple and we talked about any old bollocks, but then he had to go home to his girlfriend. In the end, I just stayed there on my own, sitting in the corner and drinking myself into an absolute stupor.